My name is Gideon Rose, and I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. I also just published a book called How Wars End, and it may be the longest time to publication of a dissertation, at least in the Harvard Government Department's history. And it's a very long time since I was a Phi Beta at Yale back in the mid-'80s. But I'm delighted to talk about it with you guys here today. The essence of the book is a study of how America has ended its wars, and in particular, why it's ended them so badly so often. What I find in the book is basically that we have indeed established a kind of pattern of screwing up the end games of our wars and transitioning very badly to the post-war era. That this pattern, furthermore, stems from the errors we make in thinking about the subject, or that policymakers and leaders have made in the past in thinking about war, and that the solution in the future for better policy next time around lies, interestingly enough, simply in following common sense, in thinking clearly about the subject and making policy accordingly, following what you might call best practices of foreign policy and national security, which for some reason actually rarely get followed. So the book has theoretical, historical, and policy-relevant aspects. And it's a kind of attempt to make serious scholarship not just interesting and fun, but also relevant for the real world today. So what is the basic theory in the book? The theory in the book starts from the great Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz's notion that war is both an act of force, he says, an act of force to compel your enemy to do your will, and an act of politics, the continuation of political intercourse, he says, with the addition of other means. So it was almost like war is so important you had to define it twice for Clausewitz. So why did he define it twice? And I say the answer is that war has both these sides to it. It is an act of force, but it is an act of force to achieve some political goal. And in effect, the Clausewitzian challenge, you might say, is how to make force serve politics. And that means that everything in war has a double aspect. Everything in war is both military and political. And therefore, success comes in keeping that dual nature of war in the forefront of your mind at all times and planning accordingly. But this is something that turns out in practice to be very hard to do. Why is it hard to do? It's hard to do because no government likes a mess. No government likes confused lines of authority or uncertain responsibilities or messy political and bureaucratic and military command arrangements. And so there's a great tendency, particularly in the American case, I think, a great tendency to try to simplify matters by creating a clear division of responsibility for the political and military aspects of war, both temporally and bureaucratically. The idea is that you have the politicians and diplomats who, in effect, take care of politics. They decide when to go to war, and then you transition things over to the military, who is charged with the task of fighting the war, and then at the end of it, when you've won, you transition back to political and diplomatic leadership, which takes care of the peace and the post-war effort and so forth. And the idea is that essentially this is a very logical division of labor. It means everybody has defined responsibilities, and it works. It should work well in practice because you know who is in charge of what. The problem is that that actually is precisely the wrong way to go about it, because since everything is both things in war, since it's both military and political, you can't do one without the other, and if you try to focus on them in isolation, you'll screw up at the end when their dual nature is revealed. A classic example of this is the Iraq War. We all know in some respects that the Iraq War was a giant screw-up. What people don't realize is that the screw-up was not simply limited to the idiosyncratic behavior of the George W. Bush administration, but rather stemmed from precisely a kind of broader pattern of failure to think about these things correctly. And this question of a dual responsibility was caught very well in a note that Tommy Franks, the CENTCOM commander, sent back to the Pentagon right on the eve of the war. He sent a rather sort of annoyed note back to try to avoid micromanagement. And he said to the Undersecretary of Defense, "You concentrate on the day after. I'll take care of the day of." And that sort of neatly captures the idea that you could separate these things out in terms of who does what and when they do it. The problem is that if you do that, if you think about this that way and you act that way, you end up like Robert Redford in the movie The Candidate. Maybe the older viewers of this will recognize that reference, where essentially a guy is a sort of airhead politician, an empty suit, who's a media campaign darling, and gets to office having won a brilliant political campaign, but without any idea of what he should do then. And the ending shot of the scene, the closing scene, is he turns to somebody and says, "So now what do we do?" And in effect, if all you've thought about in terms of the post-war plan is let's get to Baghdad, topple Saddam, and then something will happen, and then you find yourself waking up in Baghdad after Saddam has fallen and saying, "So now what do we do?" And if that's the first time you're actually thinking through that question, then you're almost bound to be way behind events and not in control of them, and things are going to spiral out of control very quickly, as indeed they did in Baghdad. It was entirely predictable what happened in the immediate aftermath of the war. And in fact, it was predicted, and the great failure, people think the great failure of Iraq, the great policy failure of the Iraq War, was either WMD or the going to war in the first place. Well, you could actually make a case for the WMD. It didn't seem as silly to think that Saddam had prohibited weapons program beforehand as it does now that we know he doesn't. And there were actually more legitimate potential grounds for going to war, again, than seem in retrospect. But what I think is sort of unforgivable about Iraq was the way that the war was prosecuted, and particularly the link of the war to the post-war aftermath, and the chaos that ensued in Iraq from sort of, in April and May 2003 on, ultimately leading to an absolute deterioration in the country, a breakdown into civil war that was only sort of partly stemmed by the surge and after, was a direct result of a failure to think through what the positive goal of the war was. As we always think about the negative goal, beating Saddam, getting rid of the bad guy, delivering your punch, knocking your enemy out. But since war is politics, it's always about what is the positive goal you're going to construct. And so you could sum up the argument of the book as basically being always start from the end result that you want to achieve, the political settlement at the end of the day, and work backwards. I joke in the book that it's no accident that the Iraq War had the worst post-war planning on record. When people thought about the term of art, the jargon in the military bureaucracy for the post-war plan, for the Iraq after we won, was called Phase 4, right? That's what the military back then termed what it called stability and support operations. What happens after the kinetic, the actual fighting stuff is over? Phase 4. Well, nobody in the world has ever gotten to the fourth item on a to-do list. If that's what you think of as creating the political settlement, the fourth item after you've done everything else, then you're bound to screw up. And so what you really should do, the simplest fix, is not just to add more stages to the end, or not just to mandate, you need to consider the later stages when you're doing the first stages. But I would say the simple practical fix would be to reverse the sequence so that you think of it as almost like a countdown to a launch, like a moonshot. And so instead of thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, think of it as 4, 3, 2, 1, with 1 being the political settlement, the stable, sustainable political endgame at the end of the day on the ground in the territory in question that you want to see emerge. Everything else is only significant insofar as it builds to that conclusion, as it contributes to that ultimate outcome. To say otherwise, to think that, everything up to there is okay and then we screwed up at the end, that's often the way people talk about these things. The war was going great and then, unfortunately there was some screw up at the end. But that really is like the guy falling out of the Empire State Building and asked 90 floors down how things are going. And he says, they're going great. Because he hasn't yet crashed. since the only test at the end of the day is not just beating up the enemy, but getting something that you want out of the war, something lasting and durable that removes the occasion for having gone to war in the first place and leaves you more secure, leaves things stable, and so forth. You have to basically evaluate the entire operation in terms of how it contributes to that goal. And so if you were to think, gee, going to war, phase 4, preparing for war. Phase 3 is the build-up to things. Phase 2 is the actual fighting, and phase 1 is, how all this leads to the outcome. Then you would properly link your strategy to what you want to see ultimately happen. Now, this pattern, I've talked a lot about Iraq. The book covers everything from World War I to World War II in both Europe and the Pacific, to Korea, Vietnam, the first Gulf War, and Iraq, and a little bit of Afghanistan. And it turns out that we invariably don't think about the ends of wars clearly or seriously beforehand. There are some cases that are more egregious than others, and there are different interesting stories in different historical periods. I wrote a book that I would have liked to read myself, and there are all sorts of great stories. The end of the war in Japan in '45 is unbelievably dramatic, far more dramatic than people think. It turns out, for example, that even after not just one atomic bomb, not just two atomic bombs, and the Soviet entry, there still is a week of incredibly tense and intricate diplomatic drama in terms of notes back and forth over a very subtle and interesting question of whether or not the Japanese emperor would be allowed to stay in power after the war and what the implications of that were. It's so complicated and complex that there was a coup inside the Japanese government in order to stop the emperor from surrendering. And it was only when the Minister of War put down the coup by refusing to join it that the emperor ultimately was saved. But that emperor, that Minister of War was himself such a loyal feudal servant of the emperor that he couldn't bear to live to see his prerogatives compromised, and so he commits suicide after putting down the coup and after telling his own staff not to commit suicide because they had to help with the peace. You couldn't write this stuff. It's amazing. The one time a political scientist ascends to the pinnacle of power in America, Woodrow Wilson, you have somebody who fights a war to make the world safe for democracy, but then never bothers to think through for himself what democracy actually means in practice. And so again, in 1918, in October 1918 and November 1918, you have a discussion going on in which you have this question that Wilson is confronted with almost for the first time, and it's amazing he never foresaw it, whether a constitutional monarchy in Germany actually was an acceptable democracy. It turns out there's a new German government in October 1918 that many felt, if they looked at it closely, met the basic terms for what we would now consider a democratic regime. But since Wilson had in his own mind conflated what you might call republicanism with democracy, the question of whether you could have a monarchy that was constitutional and be democratic, and whether that meant the reduction of the arbitrary power in Germany that he had railed against, he never really thought it through. And so he's starting to think through these questions, and as he is doing so, and as he's debating whether or not the American demands should include that the Kaiser abdicate, Germany basically falls into chaos. The entire Central European and general European balance of power goes to hell in a handbasket, and much of the chaos of the future is sowed, such that all the focus, I think, on Versailles after the fact is misplaced, because the basic determinants of what happens at Versailles are all contained in the final months of the war, and the stage is set so that what happens in the year after the actual armistice is signed is simply a working out of patterns that were already there. This goes on and on. Every case has bizarre things in it. Korea, it turns out the Korean War lasted about a year plus, maybe even a year and a half, longer than it needed to, because the Truman administration, and particularly Acheson and Truman, settled on a policy that is historically bizarre and unique in American history, which is we decided to offer political asylum to enemy prisoners in UN hands. Having captured a lot of communist prisoners, this was in the early Cold War, we decided to offer those prisoners the right to stay either in South Korea or in Taiwan and not go back. The Chinese didn't want this. They wanted an all-for-all prisoner swap. And we ultimately decided to insist on this, and it became the sole obstacle to the peace talks. This is kind of a bizarre thing, because there are a lot of people around who still remember Korea. And my father actually was fighting in the war, or at least was in the Air Force, helping the people who were fighting. And when he read the Korea chapter, he was like, "That's very strange. I don't remember it that way." I said, "Dad, this is what the records say. We now have documentary evidence. All this stuff was covered up at the time, and it was obfuscated, and things were spun so that it wouldn't be seen to be as shocking as it now seems to us." But it's absolutely fascinating. It turns out, by the way, the reason this screwed up was we thought that demand wouldn't cost us anything, but the execution of it required action inside the prison camps. And it turns out that the prison camps in Korea run by the UN were basically Abu Ghraib with kimchi. And the crazy situation there screws up the implementation of this policy such that vastly more numbers of prisoners demand asylum than we had expected, and the Chinese balk at this, and that's why the stalemate continues. Every war turns out to have its downsides. Ironically, because of their historical reputation, I give Nixon and Kissinger in Vietnam much higher marks than many other writers do, because I think they did almost the best they could with having been dealt a very bad hand. But just let me wrap up by saying that the idea that all we have to do in order to do better next time is to think more clearly about the subject. On the one hand, it's very encouraging, right? Especially for Phi Bates and people like that, right? Because it just means that the answer is to follow best practices, follow common sense, think clearly and intelligently about your subject, and you'll do better. But it's kind of distressing. It's distressing for me as a foreign policy professional, because I hate to think that the reason we screwed up so badly in the past was that so many smart people made such foolish choices. But I was led to no other conclusion by my research. And it's troubling to me, frankly, also as a social scientist. I have a political science background. And for a political scientist, a recurrent pattern of behavior over time makes you think that there should be some deep structural cause to that behavior. And so the reaction of many political scientists to my findings are, it can't just be contingent choices and people screwing up each individual case in the same way, because if they're doing that, there probably is something else making them do that. There's something pushing them to do that, because the pattern that you're seeing is the reflection, the shadow of some structural force causing that result. That's what you should try and find. Why haven't you found that? Well, I did. I tested several different theories, and I show some things that affect the decisions in each case. But at the end of the day, the biggest takeaway that I came out with was indeed that if you think about this stuff clearly, you could avoid some unforced errors, you might say. You're stuck, if you think clearly about the subject, you're stuck only with the necessary problems rather than the iatrogenic or self-caused problems that your own screw-ups cause. And I think a perfect example of this, frankly, it's not a major war, but watching how the Obama administration, an administration filled with very smart people, very well-intentioned people, has, in my opinion at least, screwed up so badly on Libya. I find this sort of remarkable. On the other hand, it's sort of depressing confirmation of what my findings were about past American wars. Here you have a situation in which the administration went to war without having any sense of what the end game was going to be. We went to war with a midterm goal, almost like like the little hash marks a third of the way down a bowling alley lane. And so, the protection of civilians from government reprisals was the official stated reason for our intervention in Libya, for Operation Odyssey Dawn. But the fact is, the administration never really considered, or doesn't seem to have considered, the basic point that that humanitarian situation arose in the first place only because of a larger and prior political situation, which was a fight over who would rule Libya. The people who were at risk in Libya were at risk because they rose up against the regime and they didn't succeed. And so the Gaddafi regime was starting to maintain or regain control, and we were worried about the reprisals. But the only way to protect the people who were Gaddafi's enemies was to get rid of Gaddafi or to help the rebels win. Other than that, there's no long-term solution, since they were fighting over something pretty indivisible, which is who would rule Libya. So it's not so much that intervening in Libya to help one side in a civil war was a bad thing to do. That's a legitimate thing people can debate. But to think that helping protect civilians in rebel areas was a necessary and sufficient definition of your goals in Libya and a good plan for how to resolve the war was naive and frankly silly on its face. And so, not surprisingly, the administration got into the war and then found itself a couple of weeks in with absolutely no idea about how to bring it to a close. As of this taping, we're about 3 months in. We're still no closer to an end. We have absolutely no sense of what the political result in Libya will be. We are, in fact, we've stated confusing things about whether regime change in Libya is actually the goal of the operation. We say it's a goal we want, but it's not the goal of the military operation. What that means to have a goal that's not the goal of the operation, then what's the goal of the operation? How does it link to your broader goal? None of this has been thought through. There's been no contingency planning. After a little while, NATO will begin to run into some serious trouble unless the United States sort of comes in and steps up its efforts or steps up its goals. So in the grand scheme of things, Libya is not a huge screw up. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter all that much. It matters to Libyans, but not a huge amount to American foreign policy. And you can debate what the right course would have been either before or now. But I don't think there's any way you can say that this was a war in which you went to war with a good strategic plan for achieving some kind of significant, durable settlement. And that's what you should do if you want to end your war well and cleanly. If you can't think through what you want to see at the end of the day, if you can't map out a plan to a final settlement, then you have absolutely no way of devising a strategy that will lead you there. You're highly unlikely to get somewhere if you don't know where it is that you want to get. And the costs are likely to be quite high in the process. So I would say that those are all reasons for not doing something, not going to war, until you have some kind of at least rudimentary sense of what you want to achieve, what it would cost, why it's worth it, and so forth, and what you would do if things start to go badly. That doesn't mean you should expect war to be like building a new deck, some kind of engineering project. And it doesn't mean you should have a hard and fast rule about we won't go in until we have a clear exit strategy for getting out. Oftentimes, note in the book, the exit strategy has been essentially to stop the fighting, but solve the problem through some kind of informal American empire. We're still in Germany, we're still in Europe, we're still in Japan, we're still in Korea, we're still in Kuwait. Essentially, oftentimes we solve our foreign policy and security problems by taking responsibility for a region of the world out of the hands of the locals and simply taking it over ourselves. The war may end, but the broader American foreign military presence doesn't. And that may well be a sensible thing. Our power has been growing very well, and it's been something we can afford. And I think we in the world have done well by that basic pattern. But I don't think anybody really wants to own Libya at the end of the day. On the other hand, I don't think anybody actually has a plan for what will happen in Libya after Gaddafi. And so we may find ourselves like a dog chasing a car, worrying about what happens when we actually catch it. So all these things are elements of war that are very interesting. I try to document them in the book, and I think, again, they're an interesting interplay of the forces of history, of broader structural factors in an environment, and the interesting intellectual work that policymaking involves. The figuring out what is due to structure, what is due to agency, and how individuals can use their agency to best effect, even on such extraordinarily high-stakes issues as war and peace. So that's what I've been working on, and I've been happy talking about it with you today.